Here it is. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Caitlin. I am the events coordinator at Square Books here in Oxford, Mississippi. And we are gathered here this evening to celebrate Megan Miranda's Such a Quiet Place. She is joined in conversation with I never know. Wendy Walker is also here to talk about the book. But before we dive into that, I wanted to do a little bit of Square Books housekeeping, tell you about some other upcoming events. As you may already know, Square Books is in the midst of a 3-day crime spree. All 3 of our events are mystery, murder, noir, thrillers. So if you need more, we've got more for you. Tomorrow, Tuesday, on the 20th at 6 p.m. Central Time, we are partnering with HarperCollins to present Karen Slaughter in conversation with Alifair Burke in celebration of the publication of Karen's latest standalone, False Witness. This is going to be on HarperCollins Crowdcast. It's still free to attend. All the information is on our website. And HarperCollins is teasing some surprised author guests who will be joining the stream. I'm not sure who they are, so I will also be there. I'm so curious. Also, the first 6 readers to purchase False Witness from Square Books will receive a signed first edition. If you're not one of the first 6, don't fear. We still have signed book plate editions as well. And then Wednesday on the 21st at 5:30 Central Time, back on our Zoom, we'll be hosting S.A. Cosby in conversation with our neighbor on the square, Ace Atkins. They'll be discussing Sean's Razor Blade Tears. It's a story of bloody retribution, heartfelt change, and maybe even redemption. And then for a palate cleanser on Monday, July 26th at 6 p.m. on our Zoom, we are delighted to welcome back Helen Ellis of Southern Lady Code fame and Ariel Lahan back to our Zoom stage in celebration of Helen's latest book, Bring Your Baggage and Don't Pack Light. It's a viciously funny, deeply felt collection of essays on friendship among grown-ass women. So after you've done all your murder, mystery, thriller stuff, you can laugh with Helen and Ariel and the rest of the Square Books gang. All right, but enough about them. We're here to talk about Such a Quiet Place. It's a twisty, locked box thriller about a mysterious murder in an idyllic and close-knit neighborhood that will keep you turning pages late into the night. It was written by the wonderful Megan Miranda, who is a New York Times bestselling author of All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger, The Last House Guest, which was a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick, and The Girl from the Widow Hills. She's also written several books for young adults, including Come Find Me, Fragments of the Lost, and The Safest Lies. She grew up in New Jersey, graduated from MIT, and lives in North Carolina with her husband and 2 children. You can follow her at Megan L. Miranda on Twitter and Instagram, and at author Megan Miranda on Facebook, or visit her website, meganmiranda.com. And she's here to discuss this very scary book with Wendy Walker. Wendy Walker is a best-selling author as well. She's written All Is Not Forgotten, Emma in the Night Before, Don't Look for Me, and Hold Your Breath, with rights sold in 23 foreign languages, as well as options for film and television. Prior to writing, she worked as a family lawyer and an investment banker. She's currently at work on her next thriller at her home in Connecticut, and maybe she will tell us a little bit about it. Whew. All right, you 2 very accomplished ladies, and I'm so glad that y'all could join us this evening to talk to our readers about Such a Quiet Place. Those of y'all joining in, please feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A function, and I will come back later to moderate those. All right, thank you, ladies. Y'all have fun. So glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for hosting us. I'm so excited to be here today, and I'm so excited to get to chat with Wendy. How are you, Wendy?
I am great, and I am equally thrilled to be here. Thank you to Square Books, and I always love talking to you about your latest thrillers. We've had opportunities in the past, I think with your last couple of books, to do this, and this is like one of my favorites. I'm just gonna say it. I mean, I love all of your books, but this one, I don't know if maybe because I grew up in suburbia and like a close knit community. but it's awesome, and everyone, really just, it's such a great read any time of year, but especially in the summer when you just want to be enjoying, an afternoon. It's just a great pull you in page turning thriller. So, but let's start by talking about it. So, I always let other authors describe the book because it's so difficult to do sometimes without spoilers. I'm sure you've rehearsed this, so let's hear it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I'm such a fan. So it means so much that you enjoyed this book. Thank you. So yeah, I guess this book is set in this really close-knit, idyllic neighborhood called Hollow's Edge. And it's the type of neighborhood where everyone believes they know everything about one another. And of course, this isn't true. And the foundation of this neighborhood was really shattered about a year and a half earlier when there was a crime and a couple next door were found killed. And the neighbors all worked together to piece together their security footage and their doorbell cameras. And they collectively kind of worked their evidence to convict one of their neighbors named Ruby. And she lived on their street. And the book actually begins a year and a half later, just as Ruby's conviction is overturned. And she comes right back to this neighborhood, which just shakes everything up again. She comes back to the neighborhood and right into the home that she shared with her roommate, Harper, who's the narrator of this story. And there's really no good answer here because no one's really sure if she's innocent or guilty. And if she's guilty, then a killer is back in their neighborhood. And if she's truly innocent, then it's likely a killer has been there all along in the neighborhood as well. So that's the beginning of the story.
And what I love about it is that her conviction is overturned really on technicalities.
Mhm.
And so it's not as if there's some clear cut evidence or a new suspects. It's really one of those situations where all that evidence is still sitting there. And so I just love how then all the neighbors get back together and form this posse again with the neighborhood chat and all of these things going on behind the scenes, that you can just feel it, because they're so in everybody's business, and they now really need to know what happened because Ruby's back. And if she's a killer, she's living among them. And I think even more than that, they have this thirst for justice against her. And it's almost curious how that thirst for justice almost outweighs their fear of her. It's like really fascinating. So I want to ask you how this is such a unique setup for a book. It really is. It's so unique. And as a lawyer, like I loved the whole conviction being overturned and all what went into that. How did you come up with this idea? What was
Yeah.
the process?
So for me, a lot of times ideas kind of merge over time where I have like the premise of something and it sits in the back of my mind for a while, but there's not really this aha story spark yet. And this was definitely the case. I love setting books in small towns. I'm always setting these books in these small town environments where I think there's just such an interesting way to explore characters who think they know everything about one another, and kind of the pros and cons of being in that type of world, the way a place can rally for you, but also how, it can feel inescapable for certain characters who can never really grow into somebody new. So for a long time, I'd been thinking I wanted to pull those boundaries even tighter and set a mystery or thriller in this neighborhood. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought like, not just this small, close-knit neighborhood where maybe you're just seeing like one side of each other, but the type of neighborhood where everyone also works together in a way. And this is a community where there aren't a lot of other industries to commute for. So pretty much everyone in the neighborhood is employed in some way by the nearby college or one of the other schools in the area. And they're all kind of home in the summer when this book takes place. But I still didn't kind of have that spark of, okay, what's the right story for this? And I love reading suspense and crime fiction and watching it and watching documentaries. And so many times when I reach the end of a documentary or a show and you reach the resolution, I would find myself thinking, I wonder what happens next. Because in so many ways that closure is almost beginning the story again. Like, where does it go from here? What happens to all these players who were involved in it? And that kind of merged with this idea and became this aha moment. Like, this is a book that is pretty much set in the aftermath. The crime has been committed, the person has been convicted, and everyone thinks they can kind of go on with their lives, but there's all these repercussions. No one's been able to sell their house or move, because, not only was there a double homicide, but the killer was also in the neighborhood. And so they're all really trapped with one another in this place. It already feels very insular at the start, and then suddenly Ruby returns. And so it kind of, the whole premise was like, what happens next? And that was what kicked off everything.
And it really is a sort of a locked room or lockbox mystery, because of all of those things you just mentioned. And I love that you didn't make it the traditional wealthy suburban community where everyone is there by choice in that it's the best place to be for your money. They really are there because they work in this community, this sort of higher education community. And this is a nice, quiet place to be around your fellow coworkers, and it's idyllic, but it's not based on, we're here because this is the best place to live in this state or whatever. And so there's something unique about that because they're intellectuals, and it's not about money. And so you have I think it enabled the whole cast of characters because they're not all the same. So let's talk about the characters, because this is a character driven book. So anyone who loves a character driven book, this one really is. We have Ruby, right, trying to understand, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about her backstory and why people were so quick to assume she could do what she was convicted of doing, was killing this couple, and also her roommate and how they ended up together, and how, because of the, we are hearing the story through her perspective, her dynamic as well, and how she views Ruby and how she, is sort of views the whole community. But so give us like a rundown of the cast of characters.
Yeah, so it was actually, I'd say this was a little bit different than other books I've written in the past, where a lot of times I write like a book, a story where a house is in the middle of the woods and the character lives alone, or maybe they have a roommate. And so there's not necessarily this cast there all the time. And so that was something that was really different and also fun to kind of grapple with, was there's this cast of characters that are around all the time, in this setting. And so I actually started this book with Ruby, which is unusual for me because I usually start with the narrator. And when I was coming up with the idea and writing just the very loose thoughts of the pitch for this idea, I even said, and the first line would be something like, there was no party the day Ruby Fletcher came home, which ended up being the first line still, which is not usually what happens when I write a book. But I had this vision of a person who, first of all, why would she come back to this place that convicted her? Like, what type of person was she? And so the story of Ruby is that she wasn't quite like everybody else in the neighborhood, which I think allowed them to kind of be willing to cast their suspicions on her from the start. She grew up, she went to college there. Her dad had a house there. And when he retired and moved, she wanted to stay. And at the same time, Harper, who's the main character, she works in admissions at the college, and her fiance had been in grad school. And as soon as he finished, he kind of took off and was sort of like, he wasn't in it for the long haul. And it left them both in this place where they really needed one another. And Harper was about 5 years older than Ruby, always kind of saw her as like a little sister, a little bit reckless. She's been the type who, she doesn't mind stirring things up. Like, she's very happy to kind of push buttons and see what happens. And that's always kind of put everyone else on edge. And that dynamic of them not really being able to get a handle on her, I think made them very, as soon as they saw her on the footage on the camera, it's Ruby, it has to be Ruby. Let's find our evidence that, shows that it was Ruby. And I think what they're also realizing is, it is a little bit of this locked box. And so if it's not Ruby, it's one of them. And I think they all had to kind of decide early on, like, what side do I want to be on? Do I want to be somebody who's looked at with suspicion, or do I want to kind of go all in, like it has to be Ruby? And so I really kind of enjoyed that dynamic. And then Harper is not, I'd say Ruby's definitely the stronger personality of the duo. And when she comes home, Harper really struggles with what to do because she's really not sure if she's innocent or guilty. The neighbors want her to kick Ruby out. And she doesn't, she's like, where does Ruby have to go? And she's in this really kind of hard place of figuring out her own feelings and grappling with what the neighborhood wants her to do, what she feels she should do for Ruby. And there's just this tense dynamic kind of all the time because they're in the house together.
Yeah, I mean, they played off each other so well, and I love how I don't want to give too much away, but I love how their sort of relationship, if you can call it that, when she returns, sort of transforms throughout the book, because at first Harper, she really feels a little bit helpless. Ruby just shows up and she doesn't really know what to do, and then she gets more and more involved in trying to figure out what really happened. And Ruby is being very mysterious, right? So Ruby's not like, they're not sitting down and having like a long, honest discussion about this is what really happened and I was unfairly convicted, and and I'm gonna no, I mean, it's sort of this weird, like, hey, I'm back. And it really, you can feel for Harper, like you can imagine yourself in that situation where this person walks back into your house, and like the unwanted house guest, like you.
Right.
So,
But no one in the neighborhood really talks face to face. And that's like, it's not just, I think if anyone had just asked, but nobody in this neighborhood would just directly ask one another, I don't think.
yeah, so tell us about the sort of supporting roles in this book, because I was so curious, and we've had this conversation many times about I'm a plotter and you're a pantser. For those of you who don't know what that means, I plot everything out like meticulously before I write, and Megan tends to just start writing, and then sort of the plot develops, and then she sometimes revises, and we all get to the same place in the end. But I always find it fascinating to hear your process for each book, because it's different for each book, because you don't plot you. And so I love hearing your journey. So this book, though, has more characters than any of your other books, and each character plays such a distinct role. So I want to know if you sat down and decided, I need a character who's the busybody, I need the character who runs the chat room, I need the sort of sketchy guys who are might be a little bit off, I need the cop, I need this, or did they come to you as you were writing?
Yeah, I am so envious of your process that you can see a book at the start, because it's like a blank slate when I start, where I start like I see a character and I see a premise and I have to write my way in. And this was another situation where I did not know my cast when I started. I started with Ruby and Harper, and it's almost like the street developed outward, that cast of characters. So first, I kind of got a sense of the neighbors, the Coras next door, and you got a sense that Tate didn't really like Ruby from the start. I didn't start thinking that everybody has to have a role. It kind of developed as I wrote. And what I did try to do, though, because it was a larger cast, was to give every home sort of a different um, household makeup, where you have the brothers who live together, which they call the frat house. And one of them had been Ruby's ex-boyfriend and had been seeing Harper since then. So that kind of added the tension in that household. And I was trying to think of like the dynamics of tension within each household, and then kind of between households. And I also was thinking about the different roles that people can occupy in this college setting, which kind of helped develop who they were. So we have people who work, Tina who works in healthcare, and she has her parents who live with her and she helps care for them. And we have people who work in admissions. We have people who are teachers. And we have people who work in like security and grounds. And I knew from the start I wanted to have a cop on the street because I felt like one of the things I was exploring in this dynamic from the start was this idea of how we view safety, and that everything they thought they were doing was keeping them safe before, like a year and a half earlier, before there was a crime. They thought, well, we have a message board and that's how we keep up with one another, and we have these security cameras and our neighborhood is safe, and there's a cop who lives on our street, and he fills us in on anything that's going on and we can ask him questions. And then during an investigation like that illusion of safety, of all of that shatters, and the role that everyone plays is what the message board is and what the security footage actually is. Like, none of that, it can be for safety, but it can also be used in a very different way.
Yeah, and the way that you set up the neighborhood with the map, and you can really, I love that you can actually, because the other part of the story, in addition to this whole cast of characters, were really important because each one of them, as you said, like they each have knowledge about the night that this couple died, and little pieces of knowledge that when standing alone really don't amount to too much, but when you put them together, right, they all added up to this conviction. But then the other thing that you do throughout the book after Ruby comes back is dismantle the sort of cohesiveness of all of those pieces. And it's really important to know where the houses are in relation to each other and the people living in them and what their motivations might be and how this evidence might be interpreted differently from how they originally thought. And again, that to me, I was like, wow, how did she do this without plotting? Because it really did. And again, and I know the answer is that it just sort of came to you as it, as you were writing, but how did you put all of those pieces together? Like the evidence, dismantling them, the characters, the map of where all the houses are. Was that something you had to go back and reconstruct, or did it just, come together at the beginning?
So I don't do a lot of plotting, but I did actually draw a map pretty early on because, like you were saying, it's really important who would see which households going in certain directions all the time. And so it's funny because I turned in my first draft and my editor asked, I feel like you have a map. Did you draw a map? Because we could like incorporate this in some way. We should talk about it. And I said, oh yeah, I have a map. I don't think they realized my map was like the size of like this sticky note. And it was like, it had a word that said trees and there were like circles for houses. And they turned it into this like, beautiful map that I love, kind of expanding on this really rough map that I had started with. But I found that really, really helpful, like almost like a guideline for myself. And when I was talking to my editor before we went back and did the second draft, we were thinking about how would this be incorporated. And I thought that this was going to be, in my mind, what they used at the trial to kind of map it out. And so it was sort of the evidence that the police officer would have presented, like, this is where everyone lives, and this is how we're attaching each piece of evidence to each household. And so that is how I started mapping it out. Like very early on, in the first chapter, when Ruby's walking down the street, Harper starts by saying like the piece of evidence that each household presented in her trial. And that kind of was the foundation for the story that happened from there. And obviously I had to rework some things as I discovered things. But that map was one of the early things that helped me write this book.
And in comparison to your other books, how easy or difficult was this book? Was this a book that, one draft and you were like, yes, it's, got it? Or was this what was the process for this book compared to your others?
Yeah, It's interesting because like I never know when I turn in a draft, like how close I am. And you know, I can sometimes have a sense. I've had like my 10th book, which was The Last House Guest, was the one that I rewrote the most and probably spent the most drafts trying to find kind of the heart of the story, the right way to tell it. This very early on, I kind of saw the structure for it. For me, the big hurdle, I think, is like finding the right structure for a story. And I knew I wanted to, I ended up incorporating the message board to kick off the beginning of each day as a way to kind of show another layer to the neighborhood, maybe things they weren't saying face to face. So when I turned it in, it was pretty close. I actually had another household that got absorbed into the rest of the community. So a lot of the work was kind of in this cast, the larger cast. So kind of paring it down to the essential, and like that, making sure every person was really relevant. And but yeah, it was one of the closer ones, which is always a lovely surprise.
Oh my gosh, yes. And so did you know going in though what the ending would be, what Ruby's fate would be, what
So there,
would be? I'm not
yeah,
gonna say what it is, but did you know that going in, or did you just sort of
so there, I love this question because it does vary book to book. I very rarely know the who done it necessarily, but I always think there's more twists than just the who done it, or there's more reveals. And I feel like there are always some that I know very early on. I knew Ruby's fate went very early on. I knew what had happened in the past early on, I'll say. It was definitely one of the books that I felt like things started clicking sooner in the draft rather than later, which is probably why it was closer when I turned it in, because I'd had those things in mind early on. And I feel like they kind of worked cohesively together.
and yeah, I mean it was just I was thinking that as the twist, unfolded, like I wonder if she knew this or if she just had this aha moment of what was going to happen.
It was just like not, in the second half of the book. Like I definitely wrote my way in and was like, but there was definitely things that I didn't know until much later in the book.
And I loved the little breakaways with the community board because first of all, you could just see it happening. And I've never had a community board, but I've lived in suburbia for most of my life. And that is what they would, I'm sure that's what they look like, but and it really did, it's so interesting what people will, put in a public forum,
Mhm.
and then as a reader you're looking at what these people are writing in a public forum and you're getting a sense of their where they stand on certain things, but then you're wondering like who's talking to whom behind the scenes. And because each community post was so drastically different, and it definitely like related to the chapter before or after it. But I loved that. It was those breakaways were great. So everybody, the Such a Quiet Place is so good. And I have just a couple more questions, but if you have just joined us, please, you can type your questions, but also you can order the book from Square Books, and please do so because you will not be disappointed. So what's happening next? For those who don't know, this book was probably finished about a year ago. Is that right? So
Yeah.
have you have something else that's finished, turned in that that you can talk about, or are you in the middle of something? What's going on next?
Yeah, so I actually turned in the first draft of my next book the day before this book came out. And I had been working on it. Like I finished Such a Quiet Place last summer. And so I'd been working on this new idea for most of, through the fall and winter and spring. And I can talk a little bit about it. I won't do plot specifics because I haven't, started revising yet. But this will probably surprise nobody, that it's set in a small town again, in the mountains in North Carolina, and it's a town that has very close access to the Appalachian Trail. And I had been thinking about types of towns that kind of embraced their history in a way, like I was thinking of Charleston with the ghost tours and how you learn the history through these like ghost tour things and historical tours. And I started to think about a town that had a very recent history and still embraced it in this way. And so this is a town that's notorious for a string of visitors who've gone missing over the past 25 years. Um, and it started with 4 hikers about 25 years ago who walked toward the Appalachian and were never seen again. And it almost became something of an urban legend, except for the fact that every few years, another visitor also disappears. So, and it's narrated by the manager of the inn who lives, the inn is like right on the edge of the trail that leads to the Appalachian.
I love that because it is, there are towns like that. I mean, these are, there are stories like that, and they're, I'm already like loving it. So that's great. And the last question that I have that I think people will find, are always very curious about, was your experience being chosen for Hello Sunshine, the Reese Witherspoon Book Club, and what that was like. And it was sort of a, it came after your publication, right? The
Yeah.
announcement. And so I know everybody is curious, like what happens? Do you get a phone call? Does it, how soon do you know? And what is it like to then have that spotlight on you and your interaction with that type of high powered celebrity who really can be a bestseller, a maker of bestsellers?
Yeah. I mean, it was just the most incredible experience. Like, I think I'm still kind of processing it several years later. But yeah, so the last house guest came out in the middle of June, and it was the August pick. So I didn't know when the book came out. And so I had just come back from a leg of tour, and it was like a Saturday. I was sitting on the couch alone. The rest of my family was out, and I got a call from my editor, and she told me, and I'm pretty sure I asked her to repeat this like at least 5 times because I was, are you really, this is happening? And then, yeah, and then like, it was just incredible. So I knew that was coming, but I knew maybe about a month beforehand. And it was just, such an amazing experience. I got to be in contact with so many book clubs who, it was so fun to see the post go live, and like everyone was saying, oh, we're gonna, who wants to read this together in our book clubs? And, it was blew my mind beyond my wildest dreams. So grateful. And I know, I wanted to ask you before we go to Q&A about like your new projects. And I know that you have some other things you can talk about as well. So can you tell us about what's coming next for you?
Well, thank you. I actually have a kind of a unique project, which will be out next, and it's called American Girl, and it's going to be an Audible original because it involves, and I now have been in contact with a woman who does have autism, and we are allowed to say that word, to say the A word. And so my character, Charlie, is autistic. She's on the spectrum. And the story is told in her voice, and she's 17 years old. So if you know my work, I usually write, really dark stuff with sort of dark narrators who have been victims of trauma or survivors of trauma, but they're adults, and their voice is usually somewhat dark, and this voice is somewhat innocent and sarcastic. And I have really been able to learn so much about the wide spectrum of people with autism and their personalities, and I just had so much pleasure writing this character. I don't know what, she came into my mind during COVID, not originally as being on the autism spectrum, but just being, she started out just having these characteristics. And then I realized I was writing a girl with autism. And so I just dove into it. It is a murder mystery. It's set in a small town. And what's really fun about it is that it has scripted scenes, which will have a cast of characters just reading dialogue, almost like you're listening to a radio play. And it will be read by a performer who is on the autism spectrum. And so hopefully it will be very authentic, and really give some diversity, right, to these to the thriller voice. But I also wrote a really dark thriller as well, and that's almost done. And and that's my usual stuff, and that will be traditionally published. And I'm not going to say too much because I don't know what will change about it, but that will be coming soon. So two sort of different vehicles coming.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, we have questions. I don't know if hi.
Me too. Hi. Thank you guys so much. That was so fun. Yeah, we have lots of questions because it was a great conversation. So, and we have a few from Facebook, and I'm going to try and kind of bounce back and forth. But anyway, enough rambling. Let's get to it. So Chris would like to know, and I think both of you can answer this if you'd like to. Do you ever surprise yourself with how dark you can go? Because you both seem like, really lovely people, and you write these, dark books. So do you want to maybe talk about that? Does it surprise you, or do you think we all have that and you're just better at tapping into it?
It's a great question. I love to hear Wendy's answer to this too, because I feel like when I start, I'm not necessarily thinking about like the content or the plot necessarily. I'm thinking about a character who's taking a journey through something. And I'm always thinking about the character arc and where they're going to, where I usually see that first, where I want the character to end up at the end before I kind of see the plot. And a lot of times as you get to know your character, I feel like the plot almost develops in opposition to this, to, how does your character grow? What do they have to get through? What are they afraid of? And not necessarily like the external fears, but what are they afraid of people knowing? And a lot of times in my books, it's about things in the past that come back to the present. And those things vary. And I don't necessarily know what they are when I start. And I really try to stay true to the character and that journey. And so it varies book to book. I'll say there have been a few times, and they're not necessarily what I would, if I said what they were, that you would think, oh, it's very dark, but there are things that I put off writing for a time because like, to me, they're the emotionally difficult scenes. And I don't want, like, there was a scene in All the Missing Girls and a scene in The Last House Guest that I didn't want to write. And the more I knew that, though, the more I knew like that was the right path, and that was the right choice, and I needed to do it. And it felt authentic. But I will say, like, I get very attached to my characters, and I don't want bad things to happen to them. What about you, Wendy?
I am fascinated with trauma and like Megan was saying, what things that have happened in the past and how they shape us going forward. And that always involves something dark. I mean, if somebody has just a perfectly rosy, wonderful past, then there's not going to be a lot of psychological damage and sort of the types of characters that fill our novels. But I've always been fascinated by that. I think that's why I was drawn to writing thrillers. And I don't know where that comes from, but that is, I love books that do deep dives into those issues as well. So sort of it's strange. I don't know. And then I feel sometimes by going to those dark places, you can then also experience the joy in your own life even greater, to a greater extent, and be more reflective of of good fortune and more empathetic, just to other people who have who've been less fortunate.
I love that. And I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, because I think one of the reasons so many people like to read thrillers is that kind of catharsis, it's like a safe place to kind of think through like the worst, and you leave kind of feeling like more prepared and better. And I don't know that, or that's, I don't know, I guess it just revealed a lot about myself. And you know, I've heard from like a lot of authors, they're like, oh, I'm so attached to them, but I've never thought about it as a way to be sure that you're going in the right direction. But that makes so much sense. Like the more you don't want to do it, then like of course you've got to do it. Okay, so we've got some questions on Facebook. Oh, there's so many windows. Thank y'all for bearing with me. Okay, here's like an oldie but goodie that comes up a lot. What are you reading now or recently that you've enjoyed, or I don't know, didn't enjoy? Don't do that. That's not nice. What did you like? What did you like?
So I feel like I'm like several months behind what everyone has been reading recently, because I was trying to finish up a draft and I was kind of deep in that. So I've been catching up on books that everyone's been talking about through the spring. And so I read The Plot, which I loved, both as like a writer, because it's, you know, about this, the main character is a writer, but also just not as a writer. I found it so twisty and interesting and well done. I am in the middle of Where the Stars Go Dark by Paula McLean, which is just hauntingly written, and I am just sucked into this world, loving it so much. I have a few books that I've be reading next. I've got Riley Sager's new one, which I'm excited for. And then I have like a stack of arcs of books coming out soon, that this is like my reward for myself for when I finish a draft, is I get to like dive into all of these books. So what about you, Wendy?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I also I think When the Stars Go Dark was one of my last, sort of just haunting, reads that was not, it's not like a, fun page turner. It's, the writing is so meticulous and beautiful. And as a writer, when I read not just the plot and a story that wows me, but when I see writing that makes me aspire to be a better writer, just the way she describes even the sky and a tree, just like is so unique and thoughtful. So that was, yeah, I agree with you on that one. And then the last book that really moved me was My Dark Vanessa, and that was a while ago, about a year ago. But that book was another one that was a real standout for me. Very dark and haunting and unique, very unique.
All right, sorry, I'm dropping these in the chat so that y'all can read what Wendy and Megan love. Okay, sorry, not that slick. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Oh, this is a good one. And again, I think both of y'all could answer this if you want, and then maybe we'll do like one rapid fire round and say goodbye. Okay, so Dustin says, thank you for this event. Thank you, Dustin, for coming. He's a huge fan, or they're a huge fan of The Girl from Widow Hills, and they're excited for this one. So did you write any of Such a Quiet Place during the kind of the thrust of the pandemic? And how did the events of the last 16 months play a part, if at all,
Yeah,
in the creation of your book?
that's a great question. And I've loved talking to other authors about this too. And like a kind of, did it impact the books we were writing that were coming out? And I came up with this idea before the pandemic. I started writing it, I think, in October or November, and then, or maybe it was December even, because it was very soon in. I think I was only 50 or 60 pages in when suddenly, the world sort of grinded to a halt. And I'll be honest that my writing grinded to a halt for a while during that time as well. And when I kind of came back to being able to kind of get into a deep headspace, I think that was for me the hardest part, was focusing on this, make-believe world during a time when there was so much happening that I had a difficult time just getting deep into this character's world. But when I got back to it, I felt like the themes that had been in this book were pulling even stronger, because it is this close-knit neighborhood. And I felt like the boundaries, when I came back to it, got even tighter. And this feeling of isolation of this neighbor, even though there's roads in and out, they were home for most of this book is set in this neighborhood. And I wrote it at a time where I was pretty much in my neighborhood all the time. So it felt, interesting to be writing about those themes while it was kind of playing out, but it's interesting because it felt like a book I would have written during the pandemic, but I came up with the idea beforehand. How about you, Wendy? Did you find your writing?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I wrote American Girl. I don't know why this character came into my head. All of my kids had moved back home. One was already home, but two moved back from college. And so I had a full house, and I would get up. I had such anxiety. I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I would just go write for, a few hours before they woke up. And then I would go make breakfast and go back to bed so it was a really weird schedule. I was in a really strange headspace, but writing that book and finishing the book was my way of sort of proving to myself that I was going to make it through. And it was like, if I can keep writing and if I can finish this book and give life to this idea, then I haven't been sort of swept away by what's happening in the outside world.
Oof, sorry, just like chills. Anyway, well, I'm glad that y'all kind of found a way to kind of, I would say muddle through, but this isn't like a result of muddling. But yeah, here we are, almost out of the woods. And I also just kind of like, I don't know if you're gonna be able to tell, but I want to brag on whoever designed the cover. It's like tactile, so you can kind of feel the like the bumps in the trees. I don't know. It's really lovely and spooky. And we do have signed bookplate editions, very handsome, which is kind of our COVID workaround while we're not yet able to have all of our events in person. And as like a townie who lives in a college town, like you nailed it. When we were kind of like, everyone at the bookstore was like, oh, we should have done this. Someone, but you did such a wonderful job. And I would like to kind of thank everybody, or not kind of, absolutely enthusiastically thank everyone for joining us this evening, spending some time with us, and to remind you that Square Books cannot do author events in person, virtual, hybrid, whatever other ways we scheme up to do them without your support. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to please buy this wonderful twisty book from us. It's a perfect companion for your beach bag or carry-on now that we're all starting to travel again. And Megan and Wendy, I'm so thankful that y'all could do this tonight. I was so excited when I heard from your publicist that this was going to happen, and just dreamy. I hope we can do it again in person one day. Would love to show you around Oxford. But I'll let y'all have the last word while I kind of drop that link to buy the book one more time, and then we'll say goodnight.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a lovely event. And thank you everyone for your questions. I really appreciate it. And Wendy, you're amazing. I always am so excited to get to chat with you. So I'm so glad we got to do this. And hopefully next year we can all do this in person somehow. Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Wendy.
Yeah, and I will echo your statements of all of the above. Thank you. I love chatting with you. I love this book. Everyone should buy the book, and everyone please support local bookstores. Continue to to purchase online however you can, and attending the events is wonderful as well, and hearing about the book. So thank you so much for having me. It's always such an honor to be asked to interview authors of this stature like Megan. So I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Square Books. Thank you for hosting us. Wonderful.
Yeah, anytime. Hope to do it again soon. These are never easy to end, so I'm just going to do it. All right. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh no. Okay, there we go.